Men decide to help a canine German Shepherd. When they see what's underneath him, they cry. It started on a rainy afternoon, the kind where every drop feels heavier than the last. Along a deserted road, a group of men noticed a German Shepherd canine curled up in the mud, unmoving, his body trembling under the relentless storm. But it wasn't just the sight of the dog that stopped them in their tracks. It was the way he refused to leave that exact spot, standing guard over something hidden beneath him. And when they finally gathered the courage to look under his protective body, their hearts shattered. Stay with us until the end to witness one of the most emotional rescues you'll ever see. And don't forget, if this story touches you, like the video and share it to inspire more acts of kindness. The rain showed no sign of letting up as the group of men cautiously approached the trembling canine. His soaked fur clung to his thin body, and despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes, he stood firm, refusing to move an inch. His dark eyes locked onto them with a mixture of fear and pleading, as if he was silently begging for help but couldn't bear to leave his post. One of the men, Brian, knelt down slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. He extended his hand, palm up, whispering softly, "Hey, buddy. It's okay. We're here to help." The dog let out a low whimper, but didn't move. His body trembled harder, but his stance remained strong, guarding whatever lay beneath him. Brian's heart ached at the sight. "Guys, there's something under him. He's protecting it." Another man, Jordan, shined his flashlight toward the ground beneath the canine. What they saw made their stomachs turn. Two tiny, motionless bundles lay beneath the dog. Newborn puppies, no more than a day or two old, barely breathing, their tiny bodies soaked in cold. The canine was using his own body to shield them from the cold rain, sacrificing his warmth and safety to keep his puppies alive. "Oh my God," Jordan muttered, his voice cracking. The men exchanged devastated looks, their tough exteriors breaking down in an instant. Grown men, hardened by life's difficulties, stood there with tears welling up in their eyes. Brian felt his throat tighten. "We have to get them out of here now." He moved carefully, inching closer to the dog. "It's okay, boy. You're a good dad. You're protecting them. But let us help now." The canine let out a weak, exhausted whine. His legs buckled slightly, as if he couldn't stand much longer. Slowly, with every bit of trust he had left, he stepped back just enough to let them reach his babies. Brian scooped the fragile puppies into his jacket, pressing them close to his chest for warmth. Their tiny hearts beat faintly against his hands. Jordan wrapped his own coat around the shivering father, lifting him gently despite the dog's weak protests. They rushed to the nearest truck, turning on the heater full blast. Brian held the puppies tightly, rubbing them gently, whispering, "Hang in there, little ones. Just hold on." The drive to the nearest animal clinic felt endless. Every second counted. The puppies barely stirred, and the father lay on Jordan's lap, his head resting heavily, eyes fluttering open and shut. When they finally arrived, the clinic staff sprang into action. The puppies were placed under heating lamps, and the canine's father was treated for severe exhaustion and hypothermia. The vet looked at the men with a grave expression. "They have a chance, but it's going to be a long night." The men sat in the waiting room, silent and tense, each lost in his thoughts. They weren't related. They weren't part of any rescue organization. They were just regular men who happened to be in the right place at the right time and made the choice to care. Hours passed. Then, just as dawn broke through the storm clouds, the vet returned with a smile. They made it, all of them. At that moment, something unspoken passed between the men. It wasn't just relief. It was a reminder that sometimes, even the hardest hearts can be softened by a simple act of love and courage. And from that day on, none of them would ever forget the sight of that brave canine father, standing guard in the storm, willing to risk everything for his babies. The next few days were nothing short of miraculous. Against all odds, the puppies grew stronger. The clinic staff named them Hope and Faith, believing their survival was a testament to both. The canine father, however, remained a mystery. Despite his critical condition, when they found him, he recovered faster than anyone expected. The vet, Dr. Helen Morris, had never seen such resilience. "It's like he's holding on just for them," she told the men when they visited daily. Brian couldn't stay away. He found himself at the clinic every morning, bringing warm blankets and sitting by the canine's recovery pen. The dog had a powerful presence, even in his weakened state. His sharp eyes never left his puppies, watching protectively from across the room. Jordan chuckled one morning, nudging Brian. "You're getting attached, man. You thinking about taking him home?" Brian sighed, his eyes glued to the dog. "I don't know, Jordan. There's something about him, like he's been through things we can't even imagine." Dr. Morris joined their conversation, holding the canine's medical chart. "I did some digging," she said, her voice low. "He's not just any German Shepherd. He's a retired military canine." The room fell silent. "He has a microchip. His name is Ranger. Served in the Army for 5 years as an explosives detection dog. There's a service record attached to his ID. But here's the strange part. He was reported missing over a year ago. No one knows what happened after that." Brian felt a chill run down his spine. A soldier, abandoned and lost, wandering until he found himself protecting the only family he had left, his newborn pups. "Does anyone know how he ended up out there?" Jordan asked, his brow furrowed. Dr. Morris shook her head. "We don't know. But what's clear is that Ranger chose to survive, not for himself, but for them." She glanced toward the tiny puppies snuggled under warm blankets. That evening, Brian couldn't shake the thought from his mind. He stood by Ranger's pen long after visiting hours ended. The dog lifted his head and met Brian's gaze. There was something haunting in his eyes. A lifetime of pain and sacrifice, but also a silent question. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, boy?" Brian whispered. "But you're not alone anymore. Not if I have anything to say about it." Ranger stood slowly, his legs still weak, and pressed his head gently against the bars of the pen. For the first time, he allowed Brian to touch him without hesitation. It was in that moment, Brian made a decision that would change his life. The next morning, with paperwork in hand and his heart pounding, he stood before Dr. Morris. "I'm adopting him, and if the puppies make it, I'll take them too." Dr. Morris smiled warmly. "Are you sure, Brian? That's a big commitment." Brian nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." As the days turned into weeks, Ranger regained his strength. Hope and Faith grew from fragile little things into lively, playful pups. And just as he promised, Brian took them all home. For the first time in a long while, his small house felt full of life, of joy, of healing. And every night before he went to bed, he'd sit on the porch with Ranger lying at his feet, the puppies tumbling around them, and he'd quietly thank the universe for putting him on that road the day they found each other. Because sometimes, the ones who need saving the most end up saving you right back. It had been a month since Brian brought Ranger and the 2 puppies, Hope and Faith, into his home. The once quiet house now echoed with the soft patter of tiny paws and the deep, calming presence of a dog who had seen more of life's hardships than any human could imagine. Ranger adapted to his new life faster than anyone expected. Despite the trauma he'd endured, there was a quiet dignity about him. He carried himself like a soldier still on duty, always alert, always watching over his new family. Wherever the puppies wandered, Ranger was never far behind, his sharp eyes keeping them out of trouble. Hope and faith grew stronger by the day. Their playful energy brought a lightness to Brian's life that he hadn't felt in years. He'd wake up each morning to the sound of their excited yelps, their tiny bodies clumsily tumbling over one another as they raced toward his bed. Ranger, however, was different. He remained cautious, protective, and distant from anyone but Brian. There were times when Brian caught him staring out the window late at night, eyes fixed on something far beyond the horizon, as if waiting for a command that would never come. One chilly evening, as a soft mist settled over the small town, Brian decided to take Ranger for a walk alone. The puppies had fallen asleep curled up on a blanket by the fireplace, and for the first time in days, the house was quiet. With Ranger at his side, Brian walked the familiar path behind his property that led to the old railroad tracks. The fog thickened around them, and the world felt still, almost like stepping into another time. "Do you miss it, Ranger?" Brian asked quietly as they walked. "The life you had before all this?" Ranger didn't respond, of course. But as they reached the tracks, the old dog stopped and sat down. His ears twitched at every distant sound, and his posture grew tense, like he was back on duty. Brian knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his broad shoulders. "It's over now, buddy. You don't have to fight anymore. You're safe." For the first time, Ranger leaned his head against Brian's chest, letting out a deep, shaky breath. It was as if he'd been holding it all in, every memory, every fear, every instinct to stay strong. And he finally allowed himself a moment of peace. In that silent exchange, Brian realized the truth. Ranger wasn't just protecting his puppies. He was carrying the weight of a past no one fully understood. His loyalty, his unwavering courage, had once been a tool for survival. Now, in this quiet life, it was becoming something new. Love, trust, and the fragile beginnings of healing. When they returned home, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the soft glow of the porch light. Hope and faith were awake again, tails wagging furiously as they ran to greet their father. Ranger lay down near the fireplace, the puppies snuggling close against him. Brian watched from his chair, a warm blanket wrapped around his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt something powerful stirring in his heart. Hope. As the fire crackled and the peaceful night settled over them, Brian whispered to himself, "Maybe we're all just looking for someone to believe in us, even when we can't believe in ourselves." That night, under that humble roof, a broken soldier, 2 fragile lives, and a man who'd almost forgotten how to hope found exactly what they needed in each other. And without knowing it, they had become a family. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into a rhythm none of them had known before. The house, once filled with silence and memories of loss, now brimmed with the sounds of tiny paws skittering across the hardwood floors and the soft, low huffs of Ranger as he kept constant watch over his growing pups. Hope and faith were thriving. Their coats had grown thick and glossy, their once frail bodies now full of youthful strength. They spent their days wrestling in the backyard, chasing falling leaves, and trying, often unsuccessfully, to climb onto the old wooden swing that hung from the giant oak tree. But as much as the puppies grew stronger, Brian noticed something different about Ranger. While his physical wounds had healed, there was still a quiet sadness in his eyes. Sometimes at night, Ranger would sit by the front door, staring out into the dark as if waiting for someone who would never return. One cold evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Brian sat next to Ranger on the porch. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and distant thunder rumbled across the hills. "You're still waiting for something, or someone, aren't you, old friend?" Brian whispered. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but his eyes didn't peep from the horizon. Brian sighed deeply. "I've read your service record, you know. You were a hero. You saved lives, did things no ordinary dog could ever do. And yet, after all that, you ended up out there in the cold, alone. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a deep roll of thunder. Ranger let out a low, almost mournful whine. Brian reached out and ran his fingers through the old dog's thick fur. You don't have to wait anymore. Whatever orders you're waiting for, they're not coming. You're home now. For the first time since he had come to live with Brian, Ranger turned his head and pressed it fully against Brian's chest, his body trembling slightly. And in that moment, the storm broke loose, rain pouring down like the sky itself was releasing years of sorrow. Inside, the puppies whimpered at the sound of the storm. Brian stood, his shirt already soaked through, and called out softly, "Come on, Ranger, let's go back inside where it's warm." But as they walked back into the house, something strange happened. A car pulled up slowly along the front of Brian's property. The headlights cut through the rain, and a figure stepped out, struggling with an umbrella against the wind. Brian watched from the porch, wary but curious. The figure approached the gate and called out through the rain, "Is there a German Shepherd here? His name is Ranger." Brian's heart stopped. Ranger froze at the sound of his name and let out a deep, uncertain bark. The man stepped closer, pushing back his hood. His face was tired, worn by worry and sleepless nights, but his eyes lit up when he saw the old dog standing there. "Ranger!" the man cried out again, his voice breaking with emotion. In an instant, Ranger lunged forward, his powerful body moving with a speed Brian hadn't seen before. He pressed his paws against the gate, barking loudly, his tail wagging for the first time since Brian had met him. Brian hurried over, opening the gate. The man dropped to his knees as Ranger leapt into his arms, whining, licking his waist, his body shaking with excitement and relief. Through the rain and the tears, the man held Ranger close. "I thought I lost you forever, buddy. I thought you were gone." Brian stood silently, watching the scene unfold. The man looked up at him, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm Captain David Holloway. Ranger was my partner, my best friend. We were separated during our last deployment. I searched everywhere for him, but he was just gone." Brian nodded slowly, his throat tight. "He's been through a lot since then, but he never stopped waiting for you." Captain Holloway stood, still holding Ranger close. "I can't believe he survived. And he's got puppies?" Brian smiled faintly. "Yeah, 2 of them. Hope and Faith. And I think they might have saved him as much as he saved them." Captain Holloway wiped his face, looking at Ranger like he'd just found a piece of his soul again. "Thank you," he said quietly to Brian. "Thank you for saving my best friend." Brian felt his chest tighten. "He saved me too, Captain, more than you know." And as the storm raged on, 2 men stood there in the rain, bound together by the unbreakable loyalty of a dog who had never given up hope. Even in the darkest of storms, the storm passed, but its echoes lingered in the air like a memory that refused to fade. That night, the house felt different, warmer, fuller. Captain David Holloway stayed for hours, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor with Ranger pressed against his side, the loyal canine refusing to leave his former partner's touch. Brian watched them quietly, sipping coffee from his chipped mug, the puppies curled up against his feet. Hope and Faith, sensing the shift in the room, seemed calmer than usual. For the first time, they saw their father at peace. Captain Holloway ran his fingers through Ranger's thick fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't believe he survived out there for so long. He always was the strongest of them all, but this..." His voice cracked and he paused to gather himself. He must have wandered for months before he found those puppies, and even after all of it, he still kept fighting to protect them. Brian nodded slowly, his eyes misty. That's the thing about him, Captain. He doesn't know how to give up. Even when his own body was failing, he stood over those puppies like his life depended on it. Captain Holloway looked over at the sleeping pups. Do you plan to keep them? Brian smiled faintly. They're family now. I couldn't imagine this place without them. They remind me that even in the worst storms, life still finds a way to rise again. Silence settled between them for a moment, thick with unspoken emotions. Then, Captain Holloway asked the question Brian had been quietly dreading. And Ranger, would you mind if he came home with me? Brian swallowed hard, his chest tightening painfully. He'd always known this moment might come. But now that it was here, it felt like trying to hold back a rising tide. He looked down at Ranger, who was staring up at Captain Holloway with a contentment Brian had never seen before. He's your dog, Brian said softly. He's waited all this time for you. He deserves to finish his days with the man he trusted the most. Captain Holloway's eyes welled with gratitude. I don't even have the words to thank you for what you did for him, and for these little ones. Brian forced a smile, though his heart felt like it was breaking. Just promise me one thing, that you'll bring him back to visit. Captain Holloway extended his hand, and Brian took it firmly. That's a promise I'll keep. The following morning was a quiet one. The rain had washed the world clean, and the sun broke through the clouds in soft, golden rays. Captain Holloway packed his truck, carefully lifting Ranger into the passenger seat. The dog didn't protest. In fact, he seemed to know exactly where he belonged. As the truck rumbled to life, Ranger pressed his head out the window, his eyes finding Brian one last time before they drove away. Brian stood on the porch, his heart aching but full of pride. He whispered under his breath, "You did good, old friend. You're going home." Life settled back into a new rhythm after that. Hope and faith became his constant companions, growing more energetic and mischievous by the day. Though he missed Ranger terribly, there was comfort in knowing the brave canine had found peace at last. True to his word, Captain Holloway returned a month later. Ranger was healthier, stronger, his eyes brighter than Brian had ever seen them. When the old dog stepped out of the truck and saw Brian, he broke into a joyful sprint, moving like he was a young soldier again. Brian dropped to his knees as Ranger reached him, wrapping his arms around the dog's powerful neck. "You didn't forget about me, huh?" Brian murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Captain Holloway stood back, watching with a smile. "He could never forget you. You saved his life, Brian." And in that moment, under a sky so clear, it felt like a blessing, Brian finally understood. Love wasn't about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go and trusting that the bonds you've built will never break, no matter the distance. From that day forward, Ranger became a frequent visitor, and every time he came back, it was as if no time had passed at all, just a hero returning home to the man who had once saved his life. Spring arrived with a quiet grace that year, as if nature itself understood the weight of the journey everyone had endured. The trees bloomed with vibrant green leaves, and the scent of fresh rain still lingered in the air. Hope and faith were nearly full-grown now, their legs long and sturdy, their playful energy tempered by the quiet wisdom inherited from their father. And though Ranger no longer lived under Brian's roof, his presence remained, etched into every corner of the house, every memory. Captain Holloway kept his promise. Every other week, without fail, the old truck would pull up to the front gate, and there Ranger would be, sitting proudly in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the horizon until they found Brian standing on the porch, waiting. Those visits became sacred. Ranger would leap from the truck with surprising strength for his age, charging toward Brian with a joy that never faded. Hope and faith would run alongside them, tails wagging furiously, the little family reunited under the wide open sky. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, Captain Holloway arrived earlier than usual. But this time, there was something different in his eyes. Brian noticed it the moment he stepped out onto the porch. "Everything all right, Captain?" he asked, his voice cautious. Captain Holloway took a deep breath, his gaze falling to Ranger, who sat quietly at his side. "Brian." Ranger's tired, more tired than he lets on. The vet says his heart is weakening. Brian felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. He'd known this day would come, but nothing could truly prepare him for it. Captain Holloway crouched beside Ranger, running a gentle hand over his graying fur. He's had a life most wouldn't believe. He's fought battles, saved lives. And even after all that, he found a reason to keep going for his pups. But now... Brian knelt down too, his hand joining the captain's as they both comforted the old soldier. Ranger's breathing was steady but slow, his eyes tired but content. "Does he have much time?" Brian asked, his voice breaking. "A few days, maybe a week," Captain Holloway replied quietly. "He's not in pain, just ready." Brian looked at the brave dog who had changed his life, the one who had stood against the storm, who had protected his babies with every ounce of strength left in him. "Can he stay here?" Brian asked suddenly, his eyes glistening. "With me, with his family, I think he'd want that." Captain Holloway swallowed hard and nodded. "I think that's exactly what he wants." And so, Ranger came home one final time. The days that followed were slow and gentle. Brian set up a soft bed on the porch, where Ranger could feel the breeze and watch the puppies play in the yard. Hope and faith never left his side. They curled up against him at night, their warm bodies pressed close, their youthful energy quieted in reverence of their father's final days. Brian spent every moment he could beside Ranger, speaking softly, his hand resting on that strong, weathered frame. "You did your duty, old friend," he whispered more than once. "You gave them life, and you saved mine too. You can rest now." And on a peaceful evening, just as the last light of day kissed the horizon, Ranger took one final deep breath. His eyes closed, and he slipped away quietly, surrounded by those who loved him most. There were no loud cries, no shouts of grief, just a deep, aching silence, and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. Brian buried Ranger beneath the great oak tree in the yard, the same tree where his puppies had first played, where they had learned to trust the world under their father's watchful gaze. Captain Holloway stood with him, head bowed, a soldier honoring a fellow warrior. They carved a simple wooden marker for the grave. It read, "Ranger, a hero, a father, a friend. Rest easy, brave heart." In the years that followed, Brian often sat beneath that tree with hope and faith at his side, watching the sun set over the hills. And though Ranger was gone, his spirit remained in every quiet moment of peace, every soft breeze that rustled the leaves above, because some heroes don't wear medals. Some don't march in parades. Some simply stand guard in the rain, and love so fiercely they change the lives around them forever. The seasons turned, and though the pain of losing Ranger remained, life found a way to gently move forward. Brian often thought about how that brave dog had walked into his life exactly when he needed him most. And somehow, even in his final moments, Ranger managed to teach everyone around him the most important lesson of all, that love, loyalty, and courage could outlast even the darkest storms. Hope and faith grew into magnificent German shepherds, strong and graceful, yet carrying a softness in their hearts that could only have come from their father. They never strayed too far from the old oak tree where Ranger rested. On sunny days, they'd lie in its shade, and on rainy nights, Brian swore he could still feel Ranger's presence there, as if he was keeping silent watch over his family from beyond. Captain Holloway became more than just an occasional visitor. He became a permanent part of their lives. He'd visit every Sunday without fail, bringing treats for the dogs and sharing stories with Brian about Ranger's years of service. Through those stories, Brian learned even more about the incredible dog he'd shared his home and heart with. He once sniffed out a hidden explosive under 6 feet of packed earth. Captain Holloway recalled one afternoon, his eyes misty with the memory. Saved our entire squad that day. I remember the look in his eyes when he found it. It wasn't fear. It was purpose. Brian nodded, staring out toward the horizon. He had that same look when we found him in the storm. Like even when he was broken, his purpose wasn't over yet. Over time, Brian found himself drawn back to the peace that had brought Ranger into his life. He began volunteering with local shelters, specifically helping to rehabilitate retired canines and military dogs who struggled to adjust to civilian life. He told every soldier's story he could, especially Ranger's. Hope and faith accompanied him on every visit. Their presence seemed to calm even the most troubled Deegs, as if they carried a piece of their father's spirit with them. And in their eyes, Brian often saw echoes of Ranger's bravery, proof that his legacy wasn't buried under that oak tree. It lived on, breathing through his pups and through every life that had been touched by his courage. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in a stunning canvas of gold and crimson, Brian sat beneath the oak tree with Captain Holloway by his side. "You ever think about how it all lined up?" Brian asked softly. That storm, finding him just in time, those pups surviving against all odds. Captain Holloway smiled faintly. "I think some things aren't meant to be explained. Some things, they're just meant to happen." Brian glanced over at the wooden marker, his heart full, but no longer heavy. He's still saving lives, you know. Every time we tell his story, every time those shelter dogs find a home. That's him. That's Ranger. Captain Holloway reached into his pocket and pulled out a small weathered medal. "I've been holding on to this. It was awarded to Ranger posthumously after our last deployment. I think it belongs here now." With a quiet reverence, they placed the medal at the base of the oak tree, a final honor for a hero whose service had never truly ended. As twilight settled over them, a soft breeze stirred the leaves above, and in that moment, both men felt it, that quiet, unshakable presence. Ranger was still there, watching, protecting, loving. Brian stood and looked towards the house, where Hope and Faith waited patiently at the porch, their silhouettes outlined against the warm glow of home. "You were right that night," Captain Holloway said, his voice low. "About what?" Brian asked. "Sometimes, the ones who need saving the most end up saving us right back." Brian smiled through the sting of tears. He did that for all of us. And so, as the final light of day slipped beneath the horizon, peace settled over the land. Ranger's story wasn't just about survival. It was about love that refused to surrender, loyalty that defined every hardship, and a legacy that would live on long after footprints faded from the earth. In the end, Ranger didn't just guard his family through the storm. He became their shelter from it. Time passed gently, like a river flowing around smooth stones. The sharp sting of loss softened, replaced by a quiet gratitude for the moments that had been shared. Brian often found himself sitting beneath the old oak tree, a place that had become not only a resting place for Ranger, but a sanctuary for his own heart. Hope and Faith had grown into remarkable dogs, strong, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. Everywhere Brian went, they walked at his side like silent guardians, their bond with him unshakable. But more than that, they had inherited their father's gentle spirit. Despite their size and strength, they greeted strangers with kind eyes and a patience that spoke of lessons learned before they were even old enough to understand them. One morning, a letter arrived that would change everything. It bore the official insignia of the military and was addressed to Brian directly. With trembling hands, he opened it and read, "In recognition of his extraordinary service, loyalty, and sacrifice, Ranger is hereby posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor for his years of distinguished service and the heroic acts that continued even after his retirement. His legacy lives on through his offspring and through the lives he touched in his final days. Brian swallowed the lump rising in his throat. The letter went on to invite him to a formal ceremony where the award would be presented in Ranger's honor. Captain Holloway would be there, and they wanted Brian to speak. Standing in front of a crowd had never been something Brian imagined doing, but for Ranger, he knew he couldn't say no. The day of the ceremony arrived under a clear, endless sky. Rows of chairs were set up on the military base's parade grounds, filled with soldiers in uniform, their medals gleaming under the afternoon sun. Hope and Faith sat proudly at Brian's side, their presence alone commanding the attention and respect of everyone around them. When Brian was called to the podium, he stood tall, clutching a small piece of paper in his hand. But as he faced the crowd, he realized he didn't need it. He took a slow breath and began, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling in his chest. Ranger wasn't just a soldier. He wasn't just a dog. He was a protector, a father, and a friend. He spent his life in service, not only during his years in the military, but long after, when no one was watching. Even when the world left him behind, he never stopped believing in the mission that mattered most, protecting those he loved. Brian paused, his eyes sweeping across the sea of faces before him. I found Ranger at his lowest point, standing in the rain, shielding his newborn puppies with the last bit of strength he had. He was broken, exhausted. But he never gave up, and in that moment, I realized something we often forget. True courage isn't measured by what you do when it's easy. It's what you do when you have nothing left to give. But you give anyway. A hush settled over the crowd. Even the most hardened soldiers seemed moved by the raw honesty of his words. Brian smiled softly and glanced down at Hope and Faith, sitting faithfully by his feet. His legacy isn't just carved in stone under the old oak tree where he rests. It lives on in these two lives he fought to protect. It lives on in every person he inspired, and in every act of kindness we choose to carry forward in his name. With a final breath, Brian concluded, So today, let's not mourn his loss. Let's honor his life by loving fiercely, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and standing tall even in the worst storms, just like Ranger did. Thunderous applause erupted as Captain Holloway stepped forward to present the Medal of Valor. He placed it gently in Brian's hands, his eyes filled with respect and gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. Brian held the medal close, feeling the weight of it, not just the medal, but the memories, the sacrifices, the love. And as the ceremony drew to a close, a soft breeze stirred through the field, lifting the edges of the American flag high above them. Brian looked toward the sky and smiled through his tears. Rest easy now, old friend, he whispered under his breath. Your mission is complete. And in that moment, under the open sky with the sun setting in brilliant streaks of orange and gold, Brian knew that Ranger's spirit wasn't just a memory. It was a legacy of courage, loyalty, and love that would endure forever.